This is a brochure that has been put out for children, for elementary school through high school age children. And it's specifically for administrators and teachers of schools. And it was produced by UCLA. No, not UCLA, sorry. It was published by the ACLU, Gender Spectrum, Human Rights Connection, the National Education Association, and the National Center for Lesbian Rights. Trans rights advocates have done an amazing job of convincing people that being transgendered is an innate condition rather than a treatment for gender dysphoria. So there is no such thing as a trans child. There are children with gender dysphoria. A treatment for gender dysphoria is transitioning, but it is not the only treatment, and it is arguably not the best treatment. So the first part of this brochure says, the expression of transgender identity or any other form of gender expansive behavior is a healthy, appropriate, and typical aspect of human development. They're saying it's a healthy aspect of development, totally dismissing the fact that there are children like me who develop gender dysphoria as a result of an underlying issue. They go on to say it's unethical and will likely cause significant emotional harm if a child's identity or expression is not affirmed. Even if a student lacks the capacity or the ability to assert their gender expression due to developmental disability or intellectual disability. Okay, let me read this one more time. I'm going to read the whole paragraph. The expression of transgender identity in any form of gender expansive behavior is a healthy, appropriate, and typical aspect of human development. It's not. A gender expansive student should never be asked, encouraged, required to affirm a gender identity or to express a gender in a manner that is not consistent with their self-identification or expression. And again, we don't want to ask children to conform because somehow that would be a horrible thing to do, despite the fact that's what parents are supposed to do as part of the job of parenting, and what teachers are supposed to do as part of the job of teaching. Any such attempts or requests are unethical and cause significant emotional harm. So we don't want to cause emotional harm by telling a child that their expression or their identification is somehow different or not consistent or maybe even inappropriate, because that might cause emotional harm. It is irrelevant whether a person's objection to a student's identity or expression is based on sincerely held religious beliefs. So it doesn't matter if you believe that this whole narrative is malarkey, or that your religion specifically does not agree with the idea that a baby can be born in the wrong body, that God does not make mistakes, I'm assuming. That doesn't matter. You still have to follow this agenda. The other thing is that you can't object on the basis of the fact that the student lacks the capacity or the ability to assert gender identity or expression due to developmental disability, age, or intellectual disability. So even if you have a 2-year-old who cannot understand gender identity, you are not allowed to question it. Even if you have a severely developmentally delayed child whose parents are saying they're gender non-conforming, you are not allowed to question it. Even if you have a deeply held religious belief that God does not make mistakes and put people in the wrong body, you have to agree with this agenda. You have to follow this idea. Otherwise, it's unethical. You're likely to cause emotional harm. Yikes. Okay, so what's next in this wonderful brochure? It says that creating a more welcoming environment for students' gender diversity is a more effective and a lasting strategy to solve the concerns associated with individual transgender students. Again, there's no such thing as a transgender child. There are children with gender dysphoria. And then it says that this will ultimately increase all students' sense of safety and engagement and inclusion. So they're saying that by creating a gender-affirming environment within the school, you are actually increasing all the students' sense of safety, engagement, and inclusion. Even though we have heard from girls, in gender affirming schools who are uncomfortable with having biological males in their showers, in their locker rooms, sharing housing with them on school trips. We're told that doesn't matter, that this actually creates increased safety for these children. Here are some definitions, some gender basics. So it says sex and gender. One of the most prevalent misconceptions about gender is that it is based solely on a physical understanding of sex, and that everyone fits into two opposite categories, either male or female. These are misconceptions. Apparently, there is not a male and a female, and our physiology and biology does not actually dictate our gender. This misconception in turn leads many to incorrectly assume that the body one's born with determines an individual's gender. Silly us. All this time, we thought that the body we were born in actually meant something. It turns out it doesn't. It's completely irrelevant. What matters is our feelings. And this is again, kindergarten through high school age. They say that gender is a complex relationship between physical traits and one's internal sense of self, as male, female, both, or neither, as well as one's outward presentation and behaviors. Okay, cisgender is a term for people whose gender identity aligns with the sex they were assigned at birth. This is the term that is ubiquitous. And I want to say it's recorded at birth, not assigned. Gender expansive. This is a new term. So I talk about being gender confused. They talk about being gender expansive. So gender expansive refers to a wide, more flexible range of gender identities or expressions than those typically associated with a binary gender system. So rather than talking about male and female, we could talk about this expansive, non-conforming spectrum of gender expressions. Transgender describes a person whose gender identity is different from what they're generally considered typical for their sex assigned at birth. Again, recorded at birth. So they're saying that a transgender person is someone whose gender identity is different from what is generally considered typical for their sex. This gets so complicated because a gender identity is how somebody feels, which is not to be confused with gender expression, which is how they display themselves to the outside world, which can be different from their biological sex. So you can have a biological male who identifies as a female but expresses as a male, and we have to treat that person as if he was a biological female because that's how he identifies, even though he doesn't present that way, even though his biology is not female. Whew. And again, they're saying a transgender person describes someone who has this incongruency. And actually, a transgender person is a person who has chosen to treat their gender dysphoria with transitioning. That's what transgender is. It's not something that's inherent or innate. Gender non-conforming describes a person whose behavior or gender expression falls outside what is generally considered typical for their assigned sex at birth. So this is somebody who acts differently than the stereotypes we tend to associate with the sex they were born. Did I mention this is for kindergarten age students through high school? This is through all of elementary school as well as through high school. Gender binary. This is beautiful. Gender binary, a social system that constructs gender according to two discrete and opposite categories, male or female. This is a socially constructed social system. Apparently, we no longer think about biology. This is a socially constructed social system that suggests that there are two discrete categories, male and female, boys and girls, penises and vaginas. What? So now we're saying this is a social construction. That actually we can talk about genitalia, but we shouldn't assign genitalia a gender because genitalia does not necessarily dictate somebody's gender identity. Kindergartners. keep wanting to put that in there. 5-year-olds, yeah. This is great. I'm so glad that our children are learning in school. Gender expression. How a person expresses their gender through outward presentation and behaviors. This includes a person's name, clothing, hairstyle, body language, and mannerisms. Stereotypes, sex roles. So we're saying that gender expression is how well somebody conforms to sexual stereotypes and gender roles. So all of those efforts at trying to suggest that stereotypes should not define us as male and female have convoluted into this weird narrative in which we have gender identity, a personal, deeply felt sense of being male, female, neither, both. Everyone has a gender identity. Okay. This deeply felt sense. Okay, so we no longer are going to talk about biology and chromosomes and genitalia and gonads. We are going to talk about deeply felt sense. And all this is at a time when we're encouraging children to go into the STEM fields. I wonder why we may have a problem with children going to STEM fields when we're telling them that their gender is based on a deeply held sense of something rather than their biology. Okay, gender dysphoria. An intense and persistent discomfort with the primary and secondary sex characteristics of one's assigned birth sex. Okay, that's gender dysphoria. And then they go on to add, affirming and supporting a person's gender identity can help significantly decrease their gender dysphoria. Conversely, rejecting or requiring a person to conceal their gender identity will exacerbate their levels of dysphoria. And this is wrong. There are children who have gender dysphoria as a result of sexual abuse. There are children who have gender dysphoria as a result of being gay in a homophobic society. There are children who develop gender dysphoria because they're being taught crap like this, and they don't fit the social stereotypes of their gender, so they develop gender dysphoria. These are not transgender children. These are children who need mental health services or simply need a supportive environment that tells them that their gender is not based on social stereotypes or sex roles. Now we have transition. The process through which transgender people... Okay, see, this is the thing. They say the process through which transgender people begin to live the gender with which they identify with. The people are not transgender until they transition. Up until the point they transition, they are gender dysphoric, not transgender. Okay? Sorry, I'm kind of heated about this because I had gender dysphoria. I know how it feels. And I know that for very many people, transitioning is absolutely the wrong thing to do. That transitioning is not the preferred treatment. And yet they're suggesting that someone is transgender and therefore should transition, when in fact, somebody with gender dysphoria can transition and therefore become transgender. So they're really conflating and kind of mixing and matching and confusing all this in a way that is very damaging to children who have confusion about gender identity and sex roles and stereotypes. So again, it talks about transitioning, changing names and pronouns and clothing. Again, all these are stereotypes. So somehow changing your name, your clothing, your hair will allow you to be the opposite gender. Oh, I shouldn't say opposite because we don't want to talk about gender binary when gender is expansive. All right, transphobia, they say, is an irrational fear, hatred, violence, harassment, or discrimination perpetrated against transgender people. And actually what's happening is that people like me who are questioning this narrative are called transphobic. So people who believe in science and chromosomes and biology and mental health care and creating reality for children are called transphobic. And we're not. What we are is we're rational people who are very unhappy with the narrative that the trans activists are spreading throughout our society. With the love and support of families, caregivers, and other adults, transgender children, again, children with gender dysphoria, can thrive. Yes, they can, especially if they get the appropriate mental health services and aren't told that just because they want to dress like a boy, they are a boy, or just because they want to play with dolls, they're a girl. They're saying that supporting a child with gender dysphoria means allowing them to live in a manner consistent with their gender identity. So that's what supporting means. So anything outside of allowing them to live in a manner consistent with their gender identity is being unsupportive. All right? So suggesting that maybe they get mental health treatment, that's unsupportive. Suggesting that maybe they are just non-conforming to gender roles, that's unsupportive. The only way you can be supportive to a gender dysphoric child is to allow them to transition. What this is doing is it's converting children with gender dysphoria into transgender people. The consequence, they say, of not affirming a child's gender identity can be severe. Of course, they need to do some fear-mongering here. The longer a transgendered youth is not affirmed, the more significant and long-lasting the negative consequences can become. Again, they have no data to back this up. In fact, most children with gender dysphoria will naturally outgrow their gender dysphoria, whereas they're saying that, oh my gosh, if we don't allow a child to transition, then there will be these horrible, negative, severe consequences, which we can't really document, but we just want to say this so that we scare everybody into believing that a child with gender dysphoria is actually a transgender person. Here they say the goal of preventing or alleviating the distress that a transgender youth, again, a child with gender dysphoria, often experiences is referred to gender dysphoria. Healthcare providers recommend that a child socially transition. Oh, do they? They're just going to make this blanket statement that healthcare providers recommend that children socially transition and live consistent with their gender identity. This is false. The most world-renowned expert in gender dysphoria, Ken Zucker, has shown that the majority of children have their gender dysphoria resolved if they are allowed to naturally progress through puberty without transitioning. This is just false. This is a lie. Again, they want to reiterate that a student's age and maturity should never be a basis for denying a transgender student the opportunity to transition. So even if a student is a year and a half, 2 years old, and they say they're a boy and they're a girl, and then go ahead and let them transition. So age and maturity should have no influence over whether or not a child transitions. I'm trying to figure out why they are denying these children appropriate mental health services. Something else that's really important to know is that schools are not allowed to tell other parents if there is a transgender child in their school. They are not allowed to tell parents if there is a biological male taking showers with biological females. They are not allowed to tell the parents of biological females if there will be a biological male spending the night with them on an overnight trip. All of this is considered protective information under FERPA, which is the Family Educational Rights Act. And so, as a parent of a student in a school where there's a transgender child, you have no right to know this. You have no right to know that there is a biological male using the locker room with your biological female children. Because the privacy and protection of these transgender children outweighs the rights of all the other children in the school. They say that a crucial element of supporting the transition of students is giving them access to sex-separated facilities, activities, and programs. Restroom, locker room, health and physical education classes, competitive athletics, overnight field trips, homecoming court, and prom are just some of the things that a child who identifies as the opposite sex should be allowed to do with the sex they identify with, regardless of whether or not it impinges or makes the other students uncomfortable. That doesn't matter. We have to make sure that we honor and validate the transgender child. Something very insidious about this. So if a student tells a teacher, administrator, or a faculty member or a staff person at a school that they identify as the opposite gender, this manual is suggesting that before talking to the parents about it, they find out whether or not the parents are okay with the idea of their child transitioning. And if not, keep that information away from the parents. So you could have a child who is actually socially transitioning at school and you don't get to know about it because they're keeping it secret from you, the parent. It says any decision to raise the topic with the parent must be carefully made and in consultation with the student. So that the school will talk to the student about whether or not to tell the parents that they have socially transitioned. Yes. In some instances, a school may choose not to bring up the subject if there is concern that the parent or caregiver may react negatively. So again, Your child could be socially transitioned at school and you won't know, and they are going to work hard to make sure you don't find out if they don't believe that you are going to be supportive. So they are going to allow a male child to go into female locker rooms and showers without you knowing it if they don't feel like you're going to support the decision to socially transition that gender dysphoric child. And they're not going to let you know your child's gender dysphoric because they don't believe that you should know about it if you're not going to support transitioning the child. And they say privacy and confidentiality are critical and important for transgender students. Again, this would be a child with gender dysphoria who do not have supportive families. In those situations, even inadvertent disclosures could put the student at potential danger at home. So they're saying, be very careful. They're telling the faculty and staff at your children's elementary schools to be very careful not to disclose that you have a child who is socially transitioned if they don't believe you're going to be supportive. And they say ultimately it must be the student's choice who they share this information with. Schools can play a critical role in alleviating the psychological distress caused by family rejection. The school environment may be the only place a transgender student feels safe enough to be themselves. To me, this is horrifying. The fact that schools are actively trying to conceal the fact that a child is gender dysphoric from parents who they do not believe will be okay with the child transitioning. So if you want to provide your child with mental health services rather than allowing them to transition, a school could actively manipulate you so that you don't find out that your child is socially transitioned at school. Yikes. Okay. And here's a little bit of information for parents who are uncomfortable with the idea of having a transgender student using the locker rooms and bathrooms and showers of the sex they identify with. The question is, what if other students have privacy concerns about using a restroom with a transgendered student? And the answer is, well, this concern may seem understandable. It is often based on the false idea that a transgender boy is not a real boy and a transgender girl is not a real girl. All right, so this goes on to talk about sleeping arrangements on field trips. A transgendered student's comfort level with sleeping arrangements will largely dictate the manner in which the related issues are addressed. So it's up to the trans student and how they feel. Okay, so a trans student has to be given sleeping accommodations with the gender they identify with, whether or not the roommates know about the student's gender identity, and the school has an obligation to maintain the student's privacy and cannot disclose or require the disclosure of the student's transgender status to other students or parents. So your child can go on an overnight trip with the school and discover that they are sharing a room with a child of the opposite sex. And if that child complains about it, they're transphobic. And if you as a parent complain about it, you're transphobic. Here it says, focusing on the perceived differences between males and females too often obscures the fact that there's a great variation among cisgender males and cisgender females. Because there are differences within the population means that we shouldn't worry about differences between the populations, basically. And that these are perceived differences. I love that. They're perceived differences. They're not real differences. They're perceived differences. Because if they were real differences, then this whole narrative falls apart. But because they're perceived differences, they get to ram this down our throats. And it doesn't matter whether or not we're concerned about it. It doesn't matter whether or not these children who have been labeled transgender are actually gender dysphoric children in need of mental health care. None of that matters. Okay, so they end this by saying, unfortunately, schools often erroneously believe that a transgender student, particularly a transgender girl, will have a competitive advantage over other players. So they're talking about concerns about athletics. And they're saying that there's an erroneous belief that a boy might have an advantage over a girl, that a biological male has an advantage over a biological female. This is erroneous. It says concerns regarding competitive advantage are unfounded and often grounded in sex stereotypes about the differences in abilities of males versus females. So they're saying our concerns regarding competitive advantage are grounded in sex stereotypes, the very sex stereotypes which they're using to defend the idea that a biological boy can be a girl and a biological girl can be a boy. And they're saying that there's this erroneous belief that biological males might have a competitive advantage over biological females. So this is the kind of material that is being given to teachers and administrators of our K through 12 schools. And what all this does is it reinforces the idea that there can be such a thing as a transgender child, which there cannot be. There is no such thing as an inherently transgendered person. Being transgender is a treatment for gender dysphoria. A child with gender dysphoria often has gender dysphoria because of the very sexual stereotypes and sex roles that people are saying define gender. So we're creating gender dysphoric children by saying that any child who does not conform to the stereotypes of their biological sex is in the wrong body. They're using language to make people feel like their concerns are completely invalid. It's possible that your child has transitioned at school and you don't know it because teachers think you're going to be unsupportive. It's possible that your girl child is showering with a biological male and you won't know it because we have to protect that transgender child's feelings. It's possible that you will have a child who has gender dysphoria who will not get appropriate mental health services because everybody will assume that they should transition that child rather than provide them with services that will help alleviate, mitigate, and resolve gender dysphoria, which is much easier than transitioning. The other thing is that once a child socially transitions, they're far more likely to medically transition. Medical transitioning causes permanent dysfunction to the child's body. Being a supportive parent, being a supportive teacher, being a supportive administrator means finding out why a child is gender dysphoric in the first place, not pushing them to be a transgender child.